Today's topic is the American Revolution, and I am from Philadelphia, which means I have studied the American Revolution at least 4 times in the school curriculum because in Philly, they prioritized the American Revolution over everything because it was the high point of when Pennsylvania was the most historically important. And ironically, this is one of the very few things I've picked up in school. I'm generally pretty cynical about school. I don't think anything useful is learned in school past age 12 or something. But I did learn about the American Revolution when I was 12, and my school we spent an entire year on it. We went through every campaign of the war. We went through we spent 4 months in the Constitution. I grew up in a conservative area, so it was still ideologically controlled by the narrative was still controlled by conservative interests at the time. So wokeness wasn't there yet. But I want to preface this by this is one of the few useful things I've learned. I don't know if it's useful. One of the few pieces of information I've learned in school, but I've added a lot of different analyses on top of it. And thankfully, the American Revolution is one of the periods people today actually do care about because people generally don't care about history that much. And so I take it and I try to be grateful when people do actually study history. And there is this whole demographic of people who are obsessed with the American Revolution. And a lot of people in America, at least, because they had ancestors who fought in it. And I had ancestors who fought in the Revolution. I'm a distant relative of the General Mad Anthony Wayne. And the American Revolution is the start of America as a country today, and that should be obvious. And America is the world's great superpower. When the Founding Fathers created America, I don't think they could possibly imagine that Australia would be an American protectorate, and American soldiers would fight in Somalia and Afghanistan. So the Founding Fathers succeeded beyond their wildest imaginations, where Thomas Jefferson thought it would take 1,000 years to settle the American West. And it actually took a century. So let's get into the American Revolution.
Perfect. Let's do it. Although it's hard for me to imagine you in history class with other students.
You honor me, but yes. The thing with the American Revolution is it's honestly not like other revolutions where the Russian and the French revolutions are about they're about having this pre-established elite and then wiping out the elite to bring in about a new elite. And ironically, the American Revolution is the opposite. It's a pre-established elite trying to hold on to its power against foreign intervention. And this is one of the very most important points to understand. I think, so, in the movie Good Will Hunting, and he references all these books in the American Revolution, and I have a vague comprehension of all the authors he talks about. I think he references Gordon and Gordon S. Wood. I think his narrative on the American Revolution, I haven't read these books, by the way. I know of the theories, though. His narrative in the American Revolution was that it was a conservative revolution of a pre-established ruling class trying to hold on to power against foreign intervention. And so if you want to look at the French Revolution, which is a useful parallel to the American Revolution, because they're both liberal revolutions happening within a single life generation of the other. The important difference, though, is the American Revolution has established 250 years of stability, where there's not been a single regime change in America since the Revolution, which is absurd, especially so if you look at third world countries, where in Thailand, in the post-World War II, for the 70 years after World War II, Thailand averaged 1 coup a year. And that's not uncommon in Africa or a lot of countries in the developing world. So it's a testament to the brilliance of America's founding fathers that America has survived this long without like civil wars or successful civil wars or coups or revolutions or that stuff. Meanwhile, the French Revolution fell into autocracy within a few months. And it's important to look at the differences between them because I think oftentimes the universe gives us lessons through history, and those who choose to learn the lessons are wise, and those who choose not to are fools. And so there's a couple important distinctions between the French and the American revolutions. One of which is that the American revolutions operated under a concept of human nature being flawed, and the French didn't. Where when I say liberalism here, I mean classical liberalism. So the traditional meaning of the word liberal is pretty comparable to libertarian. And this is why this is one of the worst things about the left. The left pollutes terms. They take terms and they make them mean the opposite thing, and they jump between definitions when they want to confuse you. So as of now, liberal means leftist or Marxist or communist-derived philosophy. So if you're a liberal, you believe in social intervention and the government making racial and sexual equity and pushing people towards utopia. That means the exact opposite thing as the original meaning of liberal. The original liberal is a classical liberal who believes in no government intervention, who believes in a free market, free labor, that sort of thing, and freedom of association. And that was an FDR thing where FDR co-opted the term liberal to mean leftist. But both the American and the French revolutions were liberals in that they believed in free market, they believed in personal freedom, all those things, removing the king. The American Revolution, and this is something Thomas Sowell talks about, has an idea called the closed vision, and the French with the open vision. So the French thought that human nature is perfectible, so we had to construct a perfect society so that we could socially engineer people to be perfect. The American Revolution thought human nature is inherently flawed, so let's establish incentive structures so that people can't do bad stuff. And so the American Revolution was established with it's why America's got the division of power between the judiciary, the executive branch, the Senate, the parliament, the state governments. French Revolution, none of that happened. It was just, let's bring about utopia. And then France devolved into autocracy because utopia is not a realistic mechanism. And that's very important. And I think there are actually two different trajectories for liberalism. There's what I call British liberalism and French liberalism. And this is true even today, where the left versus right split. The left is the descendant of French liberalism stemming from Locke, and the right today is the descendant of conservative liberalism stemming from Rousseau for the left and Locke for the conservatives. But that notwithstanding, the other major difference in the French and the American revolutions, which I've teased out, is that France was this monarchical system where the king had power, and then the king had divided power amongst all of these cronies. Where the French, there's a term I want to make up called l'ancien regimization, but no one knows how to pronounce that. So the l'ancien regime, or the old regime, I guess I'll just call it the old regime for people's ears' sake. The old regime in France before their revolution, it's what they were doing was this. It was this not. I don't think they were that bad guys. It's like Tsarist Russia. The czars were way nicer than the communists who came after, in the same way that the old French king was way nicer than the Jacobins who came after. But they're corrupt. They don't know what they don't know. And they had divided up the economy against all these special interests where you would pay money to, let's say, give your company a monopoly. And there were all of these like bizarre things where France was legally 12 different countries or something like that. And all of the 12 different countries had different legal rights. So the French Revolution was the attempt by the merchant classes to basically kill off the nobility and the bureaucracy and the king to change France as a country. And so the French Revolution makes a lot of sense from that perspective. It's kill off the rich and then establish a new utopian governance system. But then the problem you run into is it's just that's too much change for a human society. So it devolves into just butchering people through virtue signaling, where everyone was virtue signaling how left-wing they were and they butchered each other. In the American Revolution, and this is a fact people very much forget, is that the best way to see things in the American Revolution is that there were 13 colonies of Britain, and America was part of the British Empire, and as of this point, the British Empire, it of course had England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and they had a couple places around Europe like Gibraltar in the south of Spain, Majorca in Spain. But the British Empire, most of it was in America. This was before the British had gotten their colonies in Africa, and the British had some colonies in India. They had conquered Bengal, or modern Bangladesh, and they had conquered out down by Tamil Nadu in South India. But as of this point, we're in the first British Empire, and the first British Empire was mostly a North American empire. And they had, the irony is Britain had colonies in the Caribbean. And the colonies in the Caribbean, these are places that are tiny. They're like half the size of New Jersey, like Barbados or Jamaica or whatever. Barbados was worth significantly more financially to the British than North America was, because Barbados was where sugar was grown. And sugar is the oil of the 18th century, where if the tiny French island of Guadeloupe was worth more to France than all of Canada to the French, all of Canada and the Midwest. And so the British, they had been fighting the French for a very long time, and the French had colonies up in Quebec, in Canada, and they had colonies in Louisiana. That's where the white people were. And then the French built up this huge trade empire across the Midwest. It went out to Ohio, it went out to Missouri, out to the Rockies. It's a huge geographic area. But France had a total population of 80,000. New France had a population of 80,000 people, and the British 13 colonies, which stretched from Georgia to Maine, had 5 million people. And so the British in the 7 Years' War were able to take out all of France's major possessions in North America in a series of stunning victories. And a great irony of life is that oftentimes the worst thing you can do to someone is give them everything they want. Where Britain had this event called the Anno Mirabilis, where the British just wiped the floor, where the British and the French were fighting over India and America, and the Brits just wiped the floor. And they just got rid of all of France's colonies except Haiti. And what this did was it removed the incentive for the British colonists to work with the British government, because the British colonists, they had been working with the British government for fear that the French would conquer them. But when you get rid of the French, suddenly the British colonists in North America don't need the British government anymore because there's no external threat. And so the British, as of the start of the Revolution, the British had a area of territory stretching from the Canadian Arctic. They strangely had fur trading stations up in Hudson Bay, Canada, down through the eastern U.S. Everything east of the Mississippi River was a British possession. The British briefly had Florida, and they had a scheme to settle it. They tried to settle it with people from Italy and Spain, and that failed. And the Spanish took all of the French colonies west of the Mississippi, like Louisiana and Missouri and those places. But an important thing to keep in mind is that people often look at these maps of what North America looked at this time, and they think, oh my God, the French had all this territory, the Spanish had all this territory. The important way to see things, though, is the eastern U.S. was where almost all of the people were, where for the whole area, from Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania out to California, there was less than, I think, 800,000 people. I think it's between 100,000 and 800,000 people. It was a minute amount of people. And so the East Coast of America at the time of the American Revolution had, I think, like 5 to 7 million people. So there was basically 7 times as many people in the British colonies as in the whole rest of America combined. And that's really insane. And it puts into perspective how the Anglos were able to steamroll across the continent. In a 50-year period, the Anglos got from Pittsburgh to San Francisco because just the natives have been wiped out by disease. And in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, which is the term for the American front of the 7 Years' War, you see the seeds planted for the American Revolution. And Barbara Tuchman, who's a famous historian, she has a book called, I think it's The March of Folly, and she uses the example of the American Revolution as a completely avoidable conflict. And I agree. You asked me a lot of alternate history questions because that was my thing for 7 years. And I don't think the American Revolution had to happen. And I think it was something that the British government vastly mismanaged. And I think because it's interesting, after the defeat of the French in the French and Indian War, the British colonists in America, they started having this upswelling of British nationalism. Their goal was to be more British than anyone else because they loved Britain. And an important thing to remember here is that the 13 colonies, they had more in common with Britain than they had with each other because I talk about this in the Colonial America video. America was populated by specific subpopulations inside the British Isles. And for the simplicity of this video, let's divide it into New England, the Middle States, and the South. And there are greater distinctions, but for the sake of this video, those are the ones we'll deal with. The people from the South had come from the south of England. The people in the Middle States had come from the middle of England. And the people, south of England, south of America, middle of England, middle of America, New England had come from the east of England. And so all of these people knew people back in England, but they didn't know anyone from the other American colonies. And it's important to see America as a series of independent countries that happens to have Britain because all of these independent American states, and this is the hugest difference between the British colonies and the French or Spanish colonies. And it's why America is the hyper-powered country it is today, while Latin America isn't. Because the Spanish and the French didn't give their colonies self-governance, but let's say Virginia or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, these were places that were independent. Even under the British, they had their own parliaments. The British didn't take taxes from them. The British didn't really regulate them. And so what you're looking at here is 13 independent countries that were just doing their thing. And these British colonists had come from Britain to escape the British government. In New England, they had come over for religious freedom. In the Middle States, they had come over for also religious freedom and for financial freedom. In the South, they had come over for escaping political oppression. All of the American colonies are a combination of political oppression and religious freedom. Political oppression, poverty, religious freedom. And so they had come over to escape Britain. And the kinds of people who would immigrate to America were the tough entrepreneurial people who didn't like being told what to do. And so when Britain came in trying to tell them what to do, they just didn't like it. And an important thing to keep in mind is that the 13 colonies doubled their population every 15 years, which is just absurd. Where in the period between the American Revolution and the War of 1812, America's population jumped from 7 million to 12 million. And from the period from the 7 Years' War until the American Revolution, which is a 15-year period, America also doubled its population. And that's partly because America was having wide-scale immigration. It's partly because people were just having a bunch of kids. And it's ironic that, about slightly less than 1 million people came over from Britain to America in the colonial period. Those people today have 100 million descendants, which is just like, it's like dropping, and I'm allowed to say this because it's my people. You're dropping rabbits onto an island and just watching them breed. You see it with in nature where you'll drop rabbits onto an island as a species and they just keep growing because it's an ecosystem that doesn't have predators. That's basically Anglo-Americans. 13 colonies, Maine was part of Massachusetts, but Maine to Georgia, they were all independent, self-governing places, and the British never levied taxes from them. And the British called the 13 colonies non-productives because it was all the people they didn't want in England. Religious fundamentalists like the Quakers and the Puritans, the second sons of nobility, Scots-Irish tribesmen, they were just trying to get rid of the Americans and get them out of England. And the irony, though, is that past a certain point, the non-productives became actually very productive, where America started competing with Britain industrially. And the British didn't like that because the way Britain's parliament worked is it was controlled by rich people inside Britain, and America didn't have representation by the British government. And so in Philadelphia and Boston, America was starting to have the Industrial Revolution. And it's insane how early America industrialized. America industrialized 50 years before France did, which is insane because France was a significantly more advanced society in almost every other way. And also, a third of the shipping in the British Empire was made in America. And so there is this sort of underlying trend of nascent intimidation by the British of the Americans, although the British saw the Americans as complete jokes. And one of my favorite authors, Leland DeWitt Baldwin, set his metaphor for the American Revolution is imagine a mom is trying to get her teenage son to go on less dates with girls. And he wrote this in the 40s when that was more of the culture. And the son just said, you can go to hell. I'm going to move out and do it myself. Where it's this dynamic where the British are being annoying and they're being, very, shrill, while the Americans just have so much energy and enthusiasm where the slightest amount of restrictions mean they're just going to leave. And it's funny to watch this. And you guys know my political leanings, where the stuff we have today is so much worse than the things that caused the American Revolution, where Britain and America were both societies with freedom of speech. They were both societies without income taxes. They were societies without government bureaucracy, without freedom of regulation. And so it's funny that if you look at Britain in the 18th century is a vastly freer society than Britain today is. And same thing, America was a freer society in the 18th century than it is today too, unless you were black. And so you started to see a bunch of bad choices the British made, because the British, this is a weird point in British politics where they actually had a lot of political polarization between the Tory party and the Whig party. And Britain was a democracy, but it was a democracy where 3% of the population could vote. The Tories and the Whigs, there was a decent amount of political polarization between them. And so the Tories were in power, and both parties were arrogant jackasses, but the Tories were even more arrogant in a different way, though. And so George III, the King of Britain, he was the last important British king in British history. And losing America is why the British kings stopped being politically powerful, because the loss of America was so traumatizing to Britain. And so King George III, he was the main guy influencing this, while Lord North of the Tory party. He was basically the prime minister of Britain. And this is an element everyone forgets at the American Revolution, but most British people supported America in the American Revolution over Britain, where it's like the Vietnam War. It's actually very comparable, where the British government, and again, keep in mind, British and Americans, they had relatives in each other's places. British soldiers, when they came to America, a lot of them just deserted because they'd be happy to be Americans. This is a period when they're very close countries. The British couldn't recruit soldiers inside England to fight the Americans because a lot of English approved of the Americans, and I thought the Americans were in the right. And the Whig party, they were approving of the Americans. And so we have lots of Whig writers talking that the Americans are in the right here. And even Burke, who is the founder of modern Western conservatism, he wrote articles at how he approved of the American Revolution. And so what was going on here was that the British Tory party, they were trying to make an ego grandstanding gesture to say to the Whigs, we're going to be especially tough on the Americans to show that these Whig punks are wrong. And so this political polarization inside Britain caused the Tories to be exceptionally aggressive, which caused the Americans to have a revolution. And George III, George III also made a big point here about, like, you can't insult the king and you can't insult the divine right of the monarchy, because the king was not that powerful at this point. George III was, as I said before, the last British monarch who was really involved in politics. And so there was lots of ego stroking among the British, where they really should have had a more of a conciliatory route with the Americans, where if the British had said, America, you get to have a parliament and that parliament represents you apart from Britain, the Americans would have totally taken that. We can look at Canada or Australia or South Africa to see that working. And the British gave the Canadians and all the Australians and whatever, they gave them their separate parliaments because the American Revolution was so traumatizing. And there's an interesting book called The Cousins' War by Kevin Phillips, and it's an analysis of the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and the American Civil War. And he says the American Revolution was a huge turning point in British politics because the forces of monarchy and the forces of nobility and tradition, they lost inside Britain. And so in America, it's obvious why it was an important thing. Due to George III losing so hard, the British went through this period of self-discovery and self-transformation where they moved towards being more democratic and more meritocratic. And the point the author makes is that if the British lost the American Revolution, they might have gone in a very different route. And the biggest issue, the biggest one political point that the American Revolution is staked on is that in English culture, there was this idea that if you were born an Englishman, you had natural rights conferred on you by God. You could never make an Englishman operate outside the law. And so the Americans said that by birthright, they were Englishmen, and thus they deserved the rights of the English. Meanwhile, the British's argument was that the Americans were a conquered nation, like the Spanish conquering Peru or the Turks conquering Romania, and as a conquered nation, they didn't deserve rights. And so this is the big legal distinction of the American Revolution, where the British said, we can treat you however we want. British Parliament can own America because you're a conquered nation, and the Americans said no. And so this is the whole taxation without representation thing, where the underlying issue of the American Revolution is Britain can't tax us because we don't have representation in British Parliament. And the British, as I said before, they should have de-escalated here, but they didn't. And the irony is that the taxes were so low in America that got the Americans to rebel. Americans paid 1/20th the taxes of British people. And keep in mind, taxes were nothing back then. So as of today, the government makes up half of the economy of America and most Western European countries. Back then, the government was 2% of the economy. So taxes were basically nothing, but it was the principle of we can't be taxed without representation. The other big variable that I should have mentioned earlier is that the British had stopped the Americans from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so America was most British Americans lived east of the Appalachian Mountains, and the lands from between Appalachia to the Mississippi were inhabited by native tribes. And these native tribes were allies of the British, like the Cherokee or the Chickasaw or the some Algonquin and the Delaware and the Shawnee, among others, and the Iroquois. And this is one of those things that doesn't fit into leftist narratives, where the British actually supported these native tribes over the white Americans. And partly out of some kind of humanitarian sentiment, but really because they derived more wealth from fur trading with the natives than having white people in Ohio or Kentucky being farmers. And so the British purposely tried to make this reservation west of the Appalachians in order to get fur trading money off the natives. And the natives had also launched this revolt under Pontiac, which nearly destroyed all the British force west of the Appalachians. And the British didn't want to go to the cost of fighting off the natives. The problem, though, is that British America's population doubled every 15 years. So there was legitimately no way that the British Americans would stay east of the Appalachians on the East Coast. And they were just going west because they had land hunger. And the population density west of the Appalachians was so low that the Americans just naturally gravitated towards it. And it's just a staggeringly stupid decision on the British's part, because the most important thing for the Americans was land. If you look at the wealthiest fortunes in colonial America, it was landowners. And the British boxed the Americans into a place they didn't like to be because they stopped the Americans settling west of the Mississippi. They taxed the Americans without giving them representation. And then this started this ballooning of cascading effects where Boston was the main focal point of anti-British sentiment. And what happened here was that the British would increase taxes. Americans would start having civil disobedience. The British would put more soldiers into America to crack down on the Americans. The Americans would do more civil disobedience, and it's just this recurring cycle. And I'm sure a lot of you know this is stuff you hear in textbooks, like the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party and all those sorts of things. And do you have any questions before we get to the war itself?
Oh, so Curtis Yarvin thinks that we're kind of whitewashing. He basically thinks that the Americans are the bad guys in the situation.
I mean, he's a monarchist.
Yeah, are you familiar with like what's the steel man for his argument, and are you sympathetic to elements of it?
Can you explain his argument? I might be able to guess it, but can you explain to me in 2 sentences?
I think it's basically that. We were just like reckless and chaotic and disordered.
Yes,
and
but I think those are good things. So
Right.
keep in mind, I have 5 ancestors who died in the Indian Wars, so I support reckless chaos.
Right.
No, yeah,
but we didn't have like the moral authority, or we weren't necessarily on like the right side of history, to just rebel. And it's often
if you can rebel.
Right. So it's just a matter of like realpolitik as opposed to like moral sort of superiority or something. Because there are lots of groups in the world that are trying to rebel that were like, you have no right to do so.
I don't believe in the moral arc of history. I think people just do stuff when they do it. And like people ask me like, who does Palestine belong to? And I say whoever can conquer it. And it's my attitude. I think the world's a very messy and nasty place, and I support a people's right to be free if they can fight for it themselves. And so if I was at the time, I would have supported the American Revolution because I wouldn't want to be told by a king what to do. This is probably a major difference between Yarvin and I, that he's a monarchist and I'm not.
And you're not a monarchist because you just don't see it as effective use of effective way of governing?
I support monarchy and societies without. I think to have a ruling population, you need to have you need to have people who are literate. You need to have people who own property, literate property owners, and they fight war. If you remove one of them, democracy is no longer tenable. And so in America, at this time, the vast majority of white Americans own property. All white Americans could read or write. And also all white Americans fought in militias. And so that's why democracy has worked in America for so long. Well, if you look at South Africa, most of the population doesn't have any of those things. And so that's why South Africa has devolved into mob rule and why the ANC is trying to like destroy the economy. And so I support monarchy in most societies in the world. I think in most countries, monarchy is a better system than democracy because the democracy just becomes mob rule. I follow Aristotle here, where Aristotle's definition is that there are 3 political systems: monarchy, democracy, and oligarchy, and they have different incentives based off them. Where democracy, it's very reflexive, very attached to the population, but it devolves into mob rule. Oligarchies rule by a handful of people. They become extractive and tyrannical. And monarchies, the monarch becomes delusional and disconnected from reality. So I think there's 3 systems, and whatever your society is, you pick the one that fits you best.
I was saying that makes sense. Let's get to the war.
Yes, that means I'm a fascist. American Revolution. I'm going to quote. There's books that are good in abstract in that I got a lot of useful info out of them, but you should not read them because they're terribly written. The Cousins Wars is one of those, where he talks about the regional breakdown of America, and the support for the rebels was concentrated up in New England. It was concentrated among the Scots-Irish of Appalachia and in Virginia. Well, meanwhile, the support for the king was based out of New York City and New Jersey, and then little splotches in the South. And the areas that were indeterminate, the swing areas, Pennsylvania was a swing area, and then like the Carolinas and Georgia was a swing area. And about 40% of Americans were rebels. About 20% were for the king. The terms are, you win the war when you're called the patriots. One man's patriot is another man's traitor. And so about 40% were patriots, about 20% were loyalists, and about 40% were politically non-determined. And this is one of the things we forget about history, that over history, the vast majority of people don't want wars. Most people in the American Revolution, or 40%, didn't want a war. They just wanted to live their lives. But the normies don't organize, so the normies' opinions don't matter. And the war started. It's funny that this is supposed to be a 40-minute video. We're 40 minutes in and the war hasn't started. I did this for the Civil War too. But war started at Lexington and Concord, where in Massachusetts, which was the heart of the rebellion. Massachusetts was where all of the instigating started. The British were going to take the Americans. The Americans had built the powder kegs, and basically almost all young white American men owned guns and were part of militias. This is why the Second Amendment is enshrined, because the founding fathers used guns against the British government, so they knew why the public should have guns. And so the British were going to take the armaments from an American militia in Massachusetts. And keep in mind, the entire U.S. military was National Guards at this point. It was militias run by the state. And then the shot heard around the world was fired at Lexington and Concord, where the British tried to take the American armaments. The Americans fired back and then knocked back the British. And all of New England was this like cultural ethno state where it was all inhabited by Yankees who were religious fundamentalists. And so New England was this centralized bloc that was uniformly against the British. And so the British had to back out of New England, where the British held on to Boston while Boston was in a sea of rebels. And then what happened is the British attacked Bunker Hill, this hill outside Boston, and the Americans lost, but they gave the British a fight that the British didn't expect. And this is one of the things the Europeans were incredibly surprised. The Europeans were shocked at how well the Americans fought, because this is a very aristocratic, a very classist society, and they saw the Americans as rednecks, and they were consistently shocked the Americans were able to fight to hold their own against the British. And the British had the advantage in that their men were better trained and better drilled, so one-on-one the British would beat the Americans. But over the course of the war, the Americans were able to get their own military working better and better through importing drill sergeants from France and Prussia. And on top of this, the Americans were able to use advantages by living off the land, guerrilla warfare, and all those sorts of things to get even with the British. And so after Bunker Hill, the British realized they couldn't hold on to Boston. So they sailed around to New York and they put their fortification in New York. And for the whole war, New York City was the base of British power, because the irony is that the British got their support from ethnic minorities, not from the people who were ethnically British, because the ethnic minorities were scared that if the American colonists became a democracy, that they would oppress the non-British white minorities. And so, for example, the Americans attacked Quebec in Canada, thinking they could liberate the local French-Canadian population. But the Quebecois supported the British because they thought that the British monarchy would treat them better than the local than the Anglo-Americans, which is probably true because the Anglo-Americans would have colonized Quebec like Louisiana and filled it with Anglos. And then you have the Battle of New York, where George Washington, the American commander, tried to fight the British over New York, and he lost. And I should have said before, New York was populated by New York was not an important city at this point. It was like the third most populous city in America, behind Philadelphia and Boston. And New York was populated by the Dutch, who supported the British. And so as of this point in the war, you have the Americans controlling most of the 13 colonies. And the Americans put their capital in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was the most populous city in the country, and it was one of the most industrial and wealthiest and populous states in the country. Pennsylvania is called the Keystone State because it's where it was the middle state that held together the coalition between Yankees and Southerners who hated each other. And so the Constitutional Congress formed in Philadelphia in 1776, and they declared war on Britain. And they said that we all know the story. We, the people of the United States, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and they formed a ruling class under the Founding Fathers. And America basically had no right to have a leadership class as advanced as the Founding Fathers, where you have loads of men who are just incredibly admirable, like George Washington, who was the leader, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, Ben Franklin. And these are people who are polymaths. They were Renaissance men. They were often successful in private business. They were incredibly intelligent. They had read all the classics and the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Bible. And I think the 18th century was probably the 18th and 19th centuries were the peak of intellectual development ever. People in that time period were the smartest they would ever be in history. And it's remarkable the Americans did so well for being a backwater. And it's also remarkable the Founding Fathers did such a good job at engineering America, and they seem to have genuinely cared about the public good. And the Founding Fathers were also in the period before leftism showed up. So they were very blunt on topics we don't talk about very honestly, like class or sex or race or ethnicity or that stuff. And so Declaration of Independence, new American government formed in Philadelphia. And this is a loose federation between different state governments, and the state governments didn't want to give up power. And the irony is that I heard George Washington never read the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence because it filled him with so much rage. But putting the capital in Philadelphia gave a target for the British to take said capital. And so the next campaign, starting
can you say why it filled them with so much? Can you say more about why it filled them with so much range?
Because his largest colonial possession just left. I mean, it was pretty. I would be annoyed if I was him too. That like Britain's biggest colony just left. Right. They'd get India soon, so it balances out.
No, but you said Franklin.
Oh no, I said George. I meant to say George Washington, not Franklin.
Got.
Sorry, no, George III. I meant to say George III. Apologies. Yeah. So the British, their main strategy at this point was to cut up America, and so they wanted to pick New York as the logical location to split America up, and because New York has the Hudson River, where they could pull support from Canada, and New York's also in the middle of the state. So they wanted to have a multi-pronged strike. They wanted to take the capital, Philadelphia. They wanted to split up New York so that New England would be split off from the rest of the 13 colonies, because New England was the source of the revolt. And so they had a multi-pronged attack, one coming from New York City north through the Hudson, another coming down from Canada. They had another army coming out through Canada, through Lake Ontario. And upstate New York at this point was inhabited by the Iroquois tribe, and the Iroquois were some of the greatest warriors of that era, where the Iroquois, they genocided the whole area from upstate New York out to St. Louis. They genocided the whole of the American Midwest to get cheaper beaver pelts. And the Americans, in turn, genocided the Iroquois during the American Revolution. It's funny, this is an incredibly important war, and it's just tacked on to the American Revolution. But the British, they were trying to knock out the Hudson Valley, but then things started to fall apart, where instead of going up from New York, the British general, General Howe, I believe, I might be getting that wrong, he attacked Philadelphia instead. And so that took out the southern part of the attack. And so he was distracted by that. The British general who came out of Lake Ontario, he got distracted by the Iroquois. So there was one big army coming south from Canada that went through Lake Champlain and Fort Ticonderoga down, and there at the Battle of Saratoga, they met the Americans. And the Americans had fortified this position in upstate New York, and the British had been losing men and losing supplies going through the forest that is upstate New York. Keep in mind, most of America was wilderness. And so the Americans launched a surprise victory against the British at the Battle of Saratoga. And they were led by the General Benedict Arnold. And we all know Benedict Arnold is the great traitor, where he betrayed the Americans later to the British, but he was the greatest general the Americans had beforehand. And so General Gates was in charge of the Battle of Saratoga, and he didn't command very well. Arnold, his subordinate, led an attack on the British out of their trenches, wiped out the British army when they were unprepared, and that destroyed the British army in New York. And so the Battle of Saratoga was the place where the British stopped being able to conquer America, because the problem with America is the east coast of America is the size of France and Germany combined. So if the British didn't have the physical men to subdue the territory, they couldn't fight a long form war. And without the hope of splitting America up, the British were forced onto the defensive. And the Battle of Saratoga did something important, because France, Britain's rival, was looking for an excuse to help the Americans. And wiping out a British field army in America was the thing the French needed to realize that this young America was a country that was worth supporting. And the great irony here is the British were forced into the defensive because the French could attack Britain's colonies in the Caribbean. And the British cared about their colonies in the Caribbean more than their ones in America, because sugar was so valuable and the British government was dependent upon sugar. And so the British were forced to do all these other strategies after the French intervened in the war. And this was Ben Franklin's big program. Ben Franklin was America's diplomat, and he was the guy orchestrating this stuff in France. And so this is Saratoga is the first turning point in the war. And something I forget the exact timeline here, but Washington was commanding an army in Pennsylvania, and there was the British were in New Jersey. And so Washington launched a sneak attack on Christmas Day over the frozen Delaware River to take out the British military at Trenton. And he did that secretly. And the Americans were much better at guerrilla and indirect warfare like that. And that was a real point where the American army in Pennsylvania, they had a lot of defeats against the British trying to take Philadelphia, and they were losing faith. And so that victory in the winter gave the British, gave the Americans the will to keep fighting, even though it was a small victory. And at this point of the war, you ended up with the British in Philadelphia, and there was the Battle of the Brandywine as well, which was actually the biggest battle. And the Americans were out in Valley Forge outside Philadelphia, and the British were in Philadelphia partying. And Valley Forge was this period when the American army dug in outside Philly, and it was able to drill. It was able to make itself more professional. It kept its food. And Valley Forge was a real moment, because keep in mind, in the 18th century, the hardest part of waging war was feeding people. It was keeping people in the army. And America was such an open country that you could just run away and become a farmer somewhere and no one would ever know. And so the Americans' ability to survive the Pennsylvania winter, and I'm from Pennsylvania, the winters can get pretty nasty, showed that the Americans had the toughness. Because the great problem the British had was America was so huge, the only way they could defeat the Americans is the Americans gave up. And the Americans' great issue was that they were disorganized, and so it was hard for them to keep their soldiers together. And Washington himself was not that good a general, but he was a Chad. And Washington's Chadliness was so great, where he was considered a Renaissance man, he was an adventurer, He was 6'2" tall. He was considered a great man. He was considered an incredibly moral figure. And so Washington, even though he wasn't that good a general, he was considered such a moral exemplar that the Americans could use Washington as he is a great man who we should follow because he is so excellent. And so Washington's persona meant the Americans could keep losing battles because the British were better than us. But at the same time, he could hold the American spirit together. And with after Valley Forge, the Americans had really cemented themselves as we are a real military. And they took in Lafayette as a French expert and Steuben as a Prussian expert to train their military, because lots of other European powers didn't like the British. And so the Dutch and the French and the Prussians, and even the first country to recognize America was Morocco. The British had a lot of enemies. And so what we have here past this point is this gridlock, with the British in control of Philadelphia and New York, while the Americans control all the countryside. And so the British fell into this sort of myth that the South was filled with loyalists. And they thought if they attacked the South, they could raise an army of loyalists in order to start there and then conquer their way back across America. His idea was the South was filled with this hidden demographic of loyalists that would form a new army, because the problem the British had is they couldn't raise more men inside Britain because the war was unpopular in Britain. And they also, they were too busy worrying about the French to actually get a big military to conquer all of America. So the British were getting to the point where they were relying on American loyalist troops to fight the war, because they didn't have enough men to actually fight it themselves. And the numbers involved here are tiny. 30,000 men died in the American Revolution, and that's just literally nothing. 600,000 people died in the American Civil War. 60 million people died in World War II. And all the armies involved, it's like 10,000 guys. So a very small army is fighting over large amounts of terrain. And so the British left Philadelphia and they sailed down to Charleston. And this is the final campaign of the war. And this campaign was nastier. It was fought in the forest. It involved burning towns. It involved guerrilla warfare. And 18th century warfare is very gentlemanly. It's the kind of place where enemy armies would literally have dinner together before fighting. And you could go on vacation or trade with a country that you were at war with. So 18th century warfare is very tame. So when I'm saying this, I mean it's slightly less tame. And the British besieged Charleston, South Carolina, and they took it. But the problem they ran into was that the demographic that they were trying to recruit in the South just didn't exist. The South wasn't this bastion of loyalists. What happened instead was that as the British fought across the South more, they got the Southerners to dislike them. And so the Southerners gradually formed these guerrilla armies against the British. And the Americans pulled the British more and more into the interior of the South, where the general, there was Morgan's rifles, and then you had Nathaniel Greene. And Nathaniel Greene was a Yankee, but he started leading the American forces in the South. And so the Americans, for example, pulled the British into rural South and North Carolina, and the local Scots-Irish Appalachians. There's incredible battles like Cowpens or King's Mountain that are fascinating because the Scots-Irish, the Appalachians, they were able to wipe out twice British armies of 1,000 men with taking no casualties, because the Appalachians could pull the British into the forest and then just kill them all in the forest, or capture them or surround them. And so the Americans, in very badass fashion, wiped out multiple British field armies in the South. And the American Revolution lasted 7 years, and it's a war where, as I said before, neither side could really get an advantage over the size of America versus the organization of the British. And the British controlled the oceans. They could maintain supply chains across all of America. And so past a certain point, the British got desperate. And so there was this move to pull these armies from the South up north to try to attack something else. And so the British armies went north into Virginia while Washington went south. And when they were in the middle of Virginia, which was American rebel territory, the British got stuck on a peninsula in Virginia called Yorktown. And the British controlled the ocean, so peninsulas were safe for them, except this one time when the French knocked at the British Navy. And thus, this meant that there was a British army surrounded by the French controlling the ocean and then the Americans under Washington. After the siege of Yorktown, the Americans wiped out the British army, and then once the British army in Virginia was gone, the British could no longer really fight the war. And that's the American Revolution.
Wow, that was 40 minutes of build up, and then you were able to explain it in 15 minutes.
Yeah, there's not that much that actually happens in wars. You can normally explain wars by a few sentences. It's army go here, army go here, army go here. Also, anthropology is my thing. That's what I'm always going to naturally gravitate towards. And so the American Revolution, it's a relatively gentlemanly war. It's a war with basically no casualties, and within 20 years after the war, the British and the Americans were on good terms again. Or they had the War of 1812, but they were still trading with each other. And after the war, America formed into its own independent country. You have the Constitution. I would go into the Constitution, but we don't have the time. The deal with the Constitution was America established something called the Articles of Confederation, which would have turned America into like the Holy Roman Empire with all these independent countries. And that started to break down. And the Americans of this era were super small government. They didn't trust the government at all. And so they established a centralized government with checks and balances with the Constitution. And they thought, how do we make a centralized government so America doesn't fall apart? But also not make it tyrannical. So that's why they built up all these different balance checks and balances inside the government. And the Constitution is really the end of the revolution, because we have finally made the regime transition from being a British colony to being a new country. And I just find it very impressive. It's remarkable that it all worked. And it's inspirational to young guys today to think that none of these people have experience in government. It was all just a bunch of buddies, and they studied war, they studied politics, they studied government, they studied economics, and just a bunch of buddies making stuff up. They made the most successful country in history. So if you follow your dreams and listen to your heart, you too can have a transcontinental empire.
Well, we'll have to wrap on that note. Yeah. Any other recommendations or thoughts before we go?
Yeah, let me drop some books. So most of the good books, I haven't read that many books in the Revolution itself, but Alan Taylor, he is left-leaning, but he's the best author. American Revolutions, he talks about this. The Cousin War by Kevin Phillips, that's more of the anthropology side of things. Not a fun book to read, but it gives the info. Atlantic America by Meinig. This is the best history of America ever written. And I don't know, I'll throw in The Oxford History of the American People by Samuel Eliot Morison. He's a good writer. He'd cover the total historic context better than anyone. So, next topic. Do you want the Industrial Revolution or 17th century Europe?
Let's do 17th century Europe.
Great. See you then.
Perfect.
Peace.